Welcome to our deep dive today. We're tackling positive psychology, more specifically, this dualistic model of passion. You sent over some really interesting research on it, and I'm pretty curious to dig in.
Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating area. Instead of always looking at what's wrong, positive psychology focuses on the good stuff, human strengths, what helps us thrive.
Right, like completely flipping the script.
Yeah.
But I've also heard people call it pseudoscience. So that's why I'm really excited to get into this with you. To start, what exactly are we talking about when we say passion in this context?
Well, that's where the dualistic model of passion comes in.
With DMP.
Exactly. It was developed by Robert J. Vallerand, and it basically splits passion into two distinct types, harmonious and obsessive.
Okay, I think I get the general idea, but can you break those down a bit more?
Of course. So harmonious passion is when you freely choose to do something you love and it fits well with the rest of your life. Think of like a musician who spends hours practicing, but also makes time for family and friends. It's all about balance.
So it's not just about loving something intensely. It's also about how that love fits into your whole life.
Exactly. Now, on the other hand, you have obsessive passion. That's when the activity starts to control you, and it might even lead to conflict with other parts of your life.
So it's almost like passion can have a dark side.
You could say that.
Oh.
And actually, speaking of different sides, you mentioned that positive psychology has its critics. There was that 2023 study that outlined 6 major criticisms, right?
Yeah, that's right. Didn't it say something about positive psychology lacking clear theories?
Exactly. The first criticism argues that there's a lack of well-defined theories, which leads to a jumble of terms.
So does the DMP have that problem?
Well, it actually has a pretty good job defining passion and separating the two types. But the broader point is that there can be confusion in the field sometimes, like people using happiness and well-being interchangeably, even though they might mean different things.
So it's like thinking two words mean the same thing just because they sound alike. Is there like a term for that?
There is. It's called the jingle-jangle fallacy. But with the DMP, the issue isn't so much defining passion itself, but how it's measured, which actually leads us to the second criticism.
Okay, so what's the problem with measuring passion?
Well, the DMP relies a lot on self-reporting through something called the passion scale. It's generally pretty reliable, but some argue that only using self-assessment might miss some nuances.
I can see that.
Right.
Like someone might think their passion is harmonious, but their actions might tell a different story.
Exactly. We need more ways to look at it. Observations, interviews, maybe even measuring things like heart rate or something for a more complete picture,
So the DMP seems solid on defining passion, but it could do better with its measuring tools. What's the next criticism?
Okay, this one's a big one. Is positive psychology just pseudoscience? Critics say there's not enough strong evidence and that it relies on weak research.
Whoa, that's a serious accusation. How does the DMP handle that?
Surprisingly well, actually. The DMP has a pretty solid track record. There's a ton of research from all different cultures and age groups that show consistent results. But embracing more transparency and open science practices would definitely help the field as a whole.
Yeah, transparency definitely builds trust, especially when talking about something as personal as passion.
All right, what's the fourth criticism?
So this one basically says that positive psychology is just repackaging old ideas. Like it's borrowing from fields like cognitive therapy without really adding anything new.
So is the DMP just a rehash of old concepts? I mean, haven't people always talked about passion in some way?
Not exactly. It does draw inspiration from other theories, but the DMP gives us a more in-depth look at well-being. It goes beyond just saying be happy and explores how different types of passion can either lead to a fulfilling life or cause some problems.
So it's not just about being passionate, but about like the HOW and the WHY of that passion.
Yes, and the DMP is being used in all sorts of fields now, like sports psychology and addiction research. It's really making a real-world impact. Okay, I'm seeing how it's more than just a feel-good idea. What's the next criticism?
Number 5 says that positive psychology ignores the context of people's lives. Like it's too focused on the individual and not considering things like social or cultural factors.
That's a really good point. Someone's background, their environment, their economic situation,
Yeah.
all of that can affect their ability to have a harmonious passion.
You're absolutely right. And this is one area where the DMP could definitely improve. Most of the research is focused on weird populations.
Weird.
Yeah, it stands for Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, which means there needs to be more research to see how these ideas apply to other groups of people.
So a lot of the research might not apply to people from different backgrounds or cultures.
Exactly. Expanding research beyond those weird populations would give us a much more complete picture.
Makes sense. What's the final criticism?
This one's a little controversial. It claims that positive psychology is basically a tool of capitalism. Like, it sells this idea of constant happiness that's impossible to achieve so that people buy self-help books and workshops.
Oh, I've heard this one. Like happiness is just another thing to sell.
Right. Critics say it pushes the idea that you need to spend money to be happy, even though so many things that bring us joy are free.
So does the DMP fall into that trap? Is it just another way to get people to spend money?
Not necessarily. The DMP really emphasizes finding passion in things that are personally meaningful. That could be anything from playing an instrument to volunteering to just spending time with loved ones. Things that don't have to cost anything.
So finding your passion isn't about buying stuff, but about figuring out what really matters to you.
Exactly. True happiness comes from within, from doing things that resonate with who you are, not from chasing external validation or possessions.
I like that. So we've gone through 6 major criticisms of positive psychology, and the DMP seems to hold up pretty well.
It does. It shows that positive psychology, when it's based on solid research and a nuanced perspective, can be really insightful. But there's always room for improvement and for addressing those criticisms head on.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But before we move on, I wanted to touch on something we talked about earlier. We talked about the DMP defining harmonious and obsessive passion as 2 separate categories. I felt a bit too black and white, you know.
You're right to bring that up. More recent research suggests that we should think of them as separate continuums, not just an either thing.
So you could be high in both harmonious A&D and D obsessive passion.
Exactly. It's called the quadripartite model, and it recognizes that both types of passion can exist at different levels. There are actually 4 possible combinations.
I'm interested. Walk me through those.
Okay. Imagine a grid. One axis is harmonious passion, the other is obsessive passion. The first combination is high harmonious, low obsessive. This is like being in a flow state, fully engaged and joyful, but not letting the activity take over.
That sounds pretty ideal. What about the opposite? High obsessive passion and low harmonious.
That's when we see problems. The activity becomes all-consuming, and it can lead to burnout or neglecting other areas of life. Think of like a workaholic who sacrifices their health and relationships for their career.
So it's like the passion is in charge, not the person.
Exactly. Now, the third combination is really interesting. High in both harmonious and obsessive passion.
Whoa, a double dose. What does that look like?
Think of someone who's super dedicated to their work. They're willing to put in the time and make sacrifices, but they still maintain a sense of balance.
So driven, but not to the point of self-destruction.
Exactly. They've figured out how to channel that intensity without letting it consume them. Then the last combination is low in both harmonious A&D obsessive passion.
So these are people who aren't really passionate about anything right now.
That could be the case. Maybe they're still figuring things out, trying to find what they're passionate about. Or maybe they've chosen to prioritize other things in their life, like family or personal growth.
It's a good reminder that passion isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Right. And that's why this quadripartite model is so helpful. It lets us look at passion's impact in a more nuanced way. There isn't just one right way to experience it.
It's really interesting to see how these ideas are evolving. So we've explored the dualistic model of passion, looked at its strengths and weaknesses, and even gotten a glimpse of this newer model.
And I think it's important to remember that even with the criticisms, positive psychology is ultimately trying to help us understand what makes a good life. The DMP, with its developing framework, is a good example of that.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. Before we wrap up, I want to leave our listener with a final thought to consider. Think about all those passions you have in your own life, the harmonious ones and, the obsessive ones too. How are they shaping your experiences? Are they like fueling your creativity, pushing you toward success, or maybe causing a little friction in other areas of your life?
It's such an important question for everyone to think about positive psychology, and the DMP within it really encourages us to be active in our own well-being. It's not about getting rid of obsessive passion entirely, but more about understanding how it could go wrong and learning how to use it so it works for us instead of against us.
Like finding that balance between being driven and being flexible, between intensity and ease.
Exactly. And discovering and nurturing our passions in all their different forms, that's an ongoing process. The more we learn about ourselves and how our passions affect our lives, the better we can create a life that really reflects what we value.
So to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to embrace all those complex passions of yours, both the light and the shadow. Use what we talked about today to see how you can build a life that's both deeply meaningful and full of joy. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of passion and positive psychology.